There we go. Okay, this, which one is which? The red line is dollars. So here, this is dollars, and then down at the bottom, this is dollars. And then the blue line is percent. This one's percent. Percent of GDP. So now this, I only run it back to 1971 because the story before 1971 is much less interesting. And so this is where we start to get the real difference in the more recent economy. So recent, I guess, now is 40 years. But this is where change starts. Where's my, oh, it's fading. Okay. So just a little bit of story. Why not? Now I'm going to identify some of these things by administration. So the Nixon administration ends in 1974. So Nixon resigns in August of 1974, and Gerald Ford, who was not elected to be vice president, he was appointed to be vice president. He had been the John Boehner of the economy. He'd been the Speaker of the House. The vice president had been Spiro Agnew, and he had been kicked out of office for illegal activity or bribes or something. I don't know. He was a real scuzzball. And so Nixon leaves office in 1974. Gerald Ford takes over 75, 76, and then starting in 76, we get the Carter years. I'm just going to put initials here because you can write down. The Jimmy Carter years start in 1976, and he's president until January of 1981, which is when Ronald Reagan starts. So then we have Ronald Reagan is elected in 80 and reelected in 84. So we have the Ronald Reagan years. Following Ronald Reagan, we get George Bush the senior. So 88 to 92 is George Bush Sr., and then Clinton is elected in 92, and he's president for 8 years, so that goes about like this. So that's Bill Clinton, and then following Bill Clinton, we get George Bush the Younger. I don't know how, I mean, there's two George Bushes, right? I can never remember which one has which letter in their name. So it doesn't matter. You're older and younger, you don't have to remember who has a W. So George Bush the Younger is elected in 2000 and is president in 2001 to 2009, and then Barack Obama is inaugurated in 2009. Okay. So when Jimmy Carter is president, we start getting budget deficits, and you can look at them now in perspective. That's why I want to put this stuff in there. Jimmy Carter is president 1976 to 1979. The first oil crisis had been 73 to 74. The second oil crisis is 79 to 80. There's a couple of recessions in there. It had not been a good time in terms of the economy, and he really gets slammed for big increases in the budget deficit. So as a share of GDP, the percents are over here on the right-hand side. As a share of GDP, the budget deficit was around 3% of the economy when he leaves office, and this was a terrible, terrible thing to have such a large budget deficit. Previously, oh no, we won't. Let me show you. This graph shows you the debt. So remember, the debt is the difference between the accumulation of this deficits minus the accumulation of surpluses. And this was what people had expected based on 200 plus years of history. We fight a war, we accumulate a bunch of debt, and then over time we pay off that debt, and then everything's hunky-dory till we fight another war. We accumulate a whole bunch of debt, and then over time we pay off that debt, and then we fight another war, and then we pay off the debt, and then oops, there's the Great Depression, and we don't get any of that debt paid off. And then we fight another war, and then we pay off that debt, and then here's where the problems start. So the problems really start here, where this pattern of paying off the debt as following the war seems to have somehow been interrupted. Okay, so Carter's president 76 to 80. He takes a lot of heat for having overseen an economy that had very large budget deficits, had increases in the size of the budget deficit. Ronald Reagan is elected on a platform that he's going to get rid of these budget deficits. So much for that. So there's the Reagan years are not years when we get rid of the budget deficits. In fact, we have quite large budget deficits. Now, partly this is going to be some automatic stabilizers, but I'm going to get into that in just a few minutes. And then George Bush 1 is elected it was a very confusing time to be teaching economics because we had I'm going to reduce the budget deficit, I'm going to increase defense spending, and there'll be no new taxes. And it's like, okay, wait, I know that G plus TR minus TA gives me the budget deficit. You're going to increase the G because you're going to increase defense spending. You're going to decrease the TA because you're going to do no increases, and actually they were talking about cuts. So how is this going to happen when I know that this math just isn't going to work? And in fact, the math didn't work. So George Bush says no new taxes. He does implement new taxes, and that actually helps the economy. So the deficit starts going down, but he gets slammed for it again at the ballot box, and so he loses re-election in 1992. Bill Clinton has a combination of luck and good policy, and so the revenues rise, and they implement policies that continue the increasing of revenues. And so when somebody says to you, this government's never ran a budget surplus, there's another factoid if you want to get into facts that you can counter, because we did have surpluses. We had surpluses from 1993 until 2001. So during those years, the amount of tax revenue the federal government took in was in excess of their spending, their outlays. So TA is greater than the sum of G and TR. So we have surpluses. We're starting to pay down the amount of debt. There were articles written. People were worried about, oh my gosh, if we pay off all the debt, how will the Fed conduct monetary policy? In a previous incarnation of this class, I think I assigned the article that was a Greenspan type article where they were worried about how they were going to conduct monetary policy when in the wake of all these budget surpluses, because they can't use purchases and open market operations of purchases and sales of government bonds. If all of those things had been paid off, they would have no bonds, and what would they use to conduct open market operations? And they were the Fed people were coming up with new schemes for ways, what sort of assets would they be buying in order to conduct open market policy, and so on and so forth. It's been an amazing ride. What can I say? And then we get 2001, and in the summer of 2001, there are the big tax cuts. And the big tax cuts come about as a push from George Bush, which the junior. And the argument there is, why is the government running surpluses? The government's taking in more money than it's spending. This is the people's money, and the money should be returned to the people. And so it was an argument that ignored the debt, that focused only on the annual deficit or surplus, and didn't recognize that the surpluses are an important part of the cycle, that you need to run the surpluses. You can't get rid of the debt, right? You can't pay off the debt without running the surpluses. That running the surpluses is part of repaying the previous accumulation of debt. That whole straightforward Econ 1 concept kind of went away. And we got these big tax cuts, and then came 9/11. So it's not 9/11, and then they did all these things. There were big tax cuts in the summer. Politically, it was done very well because people actually got checks, and the letter that came with it was signed by George Bush. And so it was very politically well done. That you got a substantial check, you got a chunk of change, you didn't get a little bit more in your paycheck, you got a check or deposit in your checking account. It came with a letter from the president. It was clearly identified. Everybody knew they'd gotten a tax cut, and everybody knew who it came from. And then is 9/11. And then following that is the big ramping up of defense expenditures in the wake of 9/11. And all of that contributes, as I'm sure you already know, to the huge increase in budget deficits. And then following that, topic that we'll get into more on Thursday, the housing market peaks in 2006, goes bust. That takes the whole economy with it. So the article for Thursday is me and Sufi's article about the role of home equity lines in funding consumer spending and how the busting of the housing market busted the whole economy. So the whole economy goes bust starting in 2007 following the peaking of the housing market in 2006. We get, as you know, a huge soaring of unemployment. We get the whole TARP program to try to keep the financial institutions from collapsing as well. And we get these huge increases in both the amount of dollars and the share of GDP represented by the budget deficit. These figures that I have here run through 2016. We're not in 2016 yet. We're in 2013. I think you probably knew that, but I wanted to make sure you saw that. And so the last 3 years, the 16, 15, 14, and actually this year, 2013 numbers, come from another document from the Congressional Budget Office. So not the one that I assigned to you, but another CBO document where they are projecting out what's going to happen to the deficit. The projections in this graph are from the most current document, and that one comes subsequent to the article that you read. So the article that you read was written last fall, before we knew what was going to happen in January with the expiration of the Bush tax cuts, and before we knew what was going to happen in March with the sequestration. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. These estimates take into account the Affordable Care Act and the impact of that on conserving federal dollars for health care, takes into account that some of the Bush tax cuts were repealed, not all of them were retained, and takes into account some of the decrease in the decrease in non-interest spending that's actually part of the sequestration and beyond. So what we get that as we come out of this terrible thing that we've been in, that those deficits should decline. Now, I got a couple more pictures now. I'll get back to some definitions. This picture we've done. Here's the same picture that was in red just because it's so effective. That looks at the outstanding federal government debt. The dollars are on the top, and expressed as a share of GDP is on the bottom. I used to have a slide that talked about how long it took us to accumulate $1 trillion worth of debt. So it took us from 1790 until 1980 something to accumulate the first $1 trillion worth of debt. It took us then 4 years to accumulate the next $1 trillion, 2 years to accumulate the next $1 trillion. So we've gotten better at it. So we get these big increases in debt. So when we run big deficits, that adds to the debt. And until we start running surpluses, this top line is not able to come down. So even in the 1990s, when we were running those big deficits, you'll notice that this line, that it's sort of flattening out. There's an explanation, I forget what it is, as to why it doesn't actually decrease. I think part of it is that the Clinton-era surpluses, while they look impressive on the previous graph, are a relatively small number in terms of trillions of dollars. But as we can see, the effect of the Clinton-era surplus is more clearly on the bottom, where we're looking at the shares of GDP, where the debt as a share of GDP was actually nice and declining. And then we can see the more recent episodes here. And then this hitting a peak and coming back down is partly, no, that's debt, yeah, is in the projections for 2015, 14, 15, and 16. Where are we spending our money? All right, here you go. I'm going to draw on a line, and then I'll erase it. How's that? All right, so the first is defense, and these are all real. So this is all, I took the nominal values of what the federal government spends its money on, and then I divided it by the GDP price deflator. So to give you some real values so that we don't have inflation messing up what we're seeing here. So let me start with defense. Here's the defense line. Red line goes like this. So again, this is deflated by prices. So we got just real increases here. So defense spending starts to go down in the 1970s. We get a surge in defense spending in the early 1980s. It comes back down in the 90s, and then we get the post 9/11 surge in defense spending. So part of the sequestration, which is the automatic cuts that went into effect March 1st, is that it's both defense and non-defense spending that has to cut. So some of the argument about the cuts in defense and why defense can afford to take some of these cuts has to do with the fact that defense spending is so much greater than it was just a decade ago. So we've had this huge increase in defense spending associated with the fighting of a couple of wars. All right, next one. Let me start down here at the bottom. This tick line that goes up and over the top, that's healthcare. So that's the line that is Medicare and Medicaid. So Medicare is spending federal spending for healthcare for people over 65. Medicaid is means tested. That's healthcare for people of low income. Also includes SCHIP, which is the Children's Health Insurance Program. It includes a little bit, which is the National Institutes of Health, which is a really small share of the total. Healthcare spending has soared. And, these numbers, no, I didn't update these. Okay, these numbers only go through 2012, so these are all actual. There's no hypotheticals in here. These numbers have really soared, and one of the big concerns that was expressed for the last decade had been the rate of increase of healthcare spending, particularly over the last 10, 12, 15 years. That if I took and sort of projected outlines based on previous rates of increase, the healthcare spending would have been much smaller by 2012 than it actually was. The interesting thing to note is up here, is that decline. That's the impact of the Affordable Care Act. So the first provisions of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare coming in, includes restrictions on how much the Medicare reimbursement rates are. So my partner's 65, she had cancer surgery, and she's fine, but she had cancer surgery in June, and so we get these huge bills, right? So the hospital bill's like $40,000. They submit this to Medicare. Medicare pays like $4,000. So, and then the hospital just has to eat the rest of it. So it's, $40,000 is billed. Medicare pays $4,000. We had to pay, I don't know what would have been on that, some larger than I thought it was going to be number. But then there's like $35,000 that the hospital just eats, but they don't get reimbursed for that. So the decreasing reimbursement rate means the hospital still bills $40,000 for some procedure, but instead of getting $4,000, they'll get $3,900. Damn. Okay. And that's people were talking about whether or not the Affordable Care Act would bend the curve. So they wanted to see, can we take this projected rate of increase and bend it, right? Give it an inflection point so that it has a lower projected rate of increase. And the surprise has been that not only did it bend the curve, but it actually put in a negative slope instead of just making. So not just second derivative was negative, but first derivative negative as well. Okay. What else do I have in here? Green line is income security. Income security includes welfare programs. Federal funding for welfare programs, so that's the green line here. And that's one where you're going to get some expansion, of course, in 2007, 2009 as a result of automatic stabilizers. So the income security line is one that's really affected by automatic stabilizers. In a recession, it's going to particularly go up. Income security also includes food stamps, which is, again, almost everything in income security is means tested. Food stamps are included in income security as well. Okay, oops, wrong button. Erase a link. I did that one. Interest. Interest is interesting. So the blue line here is interest, and the interest, you can see that the interest peaks and then comes down. How could the interest is the amount that the federal government is paying. Thank you very much for lending to me. Here's the extra money that you get back. So those are the interest payments made by the government. Even though the amount of debt that's outstanding has soared, interest payments have come down. How come? Interest rates, right. So lower interest rates, and also they did some refinancing. So there was some of the debt had been tied up in long-term high interest rates. So in the 1980s, the interest rates were all really, really high. So any 30-year bond they wrote in the 1980s was going to be a very, very high interest rate. They refinanced a lot of that into shorter term, some into shorter term and some into longer term, but they still refinanced it into lower interest rate debt. So a lot of refinancing of old debt that took place here in the 1990s, and then just the fact that interest rates are so very low right now means that, those interest payments on the debt are pretty low. As long as the government is borrowing at 30-year rates right now, we're pretty good. That means they will have locked in those 30-year interest rates. If they're borrowing at 3-month chunks, that's not as good, because then when interest rates start to rise, their interest costs will go up as well. Social Security, can I talk about that? Social Security is, what color is Social Security? Social Security is gray. That's funny, because it's for gray-haired people. Okay, so here's Social Security. Social Security is rising. The increases in Social Security are pretty much a result of the aging of the population. So there's not any big story there. It's going to reflect the aging of the population. That's the baby boom that we saw on some other slide the other day, and which we'll talk about again on another day. And then the last piece is other. Whoops, hold on, I need a pen, there we go. The last piece is other. Other includes TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. Okay, I always want T to be temporary because it was that as well. Much of the TARP money has actually been paid back. So the paybacks of the TARP money show up as a negative number in future years. But the other, you can see the other bounces along here. That's everything else. So what's in everything else? Here you go. Everything else includes federal government spending for international affairs, for science, National Science Foundation, all of the labs on campus, federally funded through science, space, Lawrence Berkeley Lab, other places, NASA, energy, Lawrence Berkeley Lab, natural resources, that's down the hill, agriculture, that's down the hill, commerce, that's where the TARP money was, transportation, community development, education, veterans benefits, justice, and quote, general government. So everything that is in Washington, D.C., other than defense, Social Security, income security, health, and interest is included in other, absolutely everything else. So when people say, can't they just cut waste, or can't they just cut the rest of the government and get rid of this problem? No, they can't. So if the government went through and eliminated 100% of the spending for all of those categories, that does not eliminate the deficit. So you can't eliminate 100% of that spending and get rid of the deficit. The deficit is addressed by dealing with the big four: defense, healthcare, Social Security, and interest. Okay, all right, what am I doing? 302. Let me make some choices. I'll choose what I've got somewhere. All right, we talked about automatic stable. Oh, Patrick, thank you. I don't think so. So the question is, I've got a slide future. Let me find this slide. How far does this go? Okay, so Patrick's question is, when the baby boomers die off, so baby boomers are the group that's 1946, born 1946 and 1964. So when they're gone, then do we expect to see declines in Medicare spending and declines in Social Security spending? So somebody who's born 1946 and lives 80 years lives until 2026, is that right? Somebody who's born 1964 and lives 80 years lives until 2044. So these numbers go to 2035. So the very end of this is going to capture the beginnings of the end of the baby boomers. And I think that the expectation is that these lines may flatten out a little bit, but not that they're expected to decline. So that's Medicare, and then there's Social Security, which again only goes to 2039. So there's an expectation that they flatten. And it partly has to do with that the baby boom was an increase in fertility, but then now we have a larger population, which is not having 4 kids each, but they're having 2 kids each. And so the numbers of people who will be old, and you guys are expected to have a longer life length than your grandparents, the numbers of people who will be old doesn't necessarily go down. How much of the increase in Medicare Medicaid is attributed to rising costs of healthcare? No, I don't have that chart. How much of the increase in Medicare Medicaid is the result of life length, and how much of it is a result of increase in spending per procedure? Is that right? I don't have that number here. I've seen it. And was it in something that I read over the weekend? It wasn't. I don't think it was in that CBO article. It was in something else that I read. So to the extent that the Affordable Care Act, which is more commonly known now as Obamacare, to the extent the Affordable Care Act does not get repealed, then the expectation is that the per procedure rate will go down. That part of the Affordable Care Act is savings in Medicare expenditures through lower reimbursement rates. Yeah. Okay. Alrighty. Oops. Go to slide. Let's see. This piece we talked about, so I'm going to just put it up there and go on. Automatic stabilizers versus discretionary policy we talked about last week when we were doing the New Deal. That automatic stabilizers are something that automatically go into deficit when the economy is in a recession, helps to make a recession not as bad as it would be otherwise. The discretionary policy are the changes that are made independent of these automatic changes. Was an exam question too? Oh yeah, it was. That's right. It was an exam question. That's right. Did not go well. Oh, so maybe I should go back to it. Okay. The GSIs just said go back to that one actually. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let me find the. All right. Hold on. I got a slide coming up, so I'll get to that. All right. How does the government pay their bills when they run a deficit? I want you to make sure that you know they do not print money. So as a result of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, when the federal government runs a deficit, they cannot simply print money. In order to pay their bills, they have to borrow. And the Federal Reserve Act was set up where they cannot borrow directly from the Federal Reserve. So different governments can set up their central banks in different ways. We set ours up so that the federal government, when they run a deficit, has to borrow from the private sector. They have to borrow from, which is to say, the non-Federal Reserve sector. They can't go to Ben Bernanke and say, we want to fight a couple of wars. You're the central banker, you work for me, you're going to fund it, because he does not work for them. The central banker does not work for the federal government, and therefore the federal government can't make the central bank fund the federal government's activities. They have to be able to borrow. They can try to enforce an agreement whereby the Fed agrees to keep interest rates low. They have to be, the federal government has, the question is how does these various agreements work? They have to be able to find somebody who's not the Fed who will buy the bond in the first place. The Fed can turn around and buy that bond from a person within 5 minutes. So the Fed can be the secondary buyer, they can't be the primary buyer. Okay? And so then when they promise, for instance, in World War